And thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. So yes, I'm Sarah. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Texas. And I'm really excited to talk to you today about some of my dissertation work that I've been doing here in Austin. So a little bit about me. I consider myself kind of a mix of disciplines. So I'm a paleontologist, but I'm also an evolutionary biologist. So I spend kind of equal times working in the field, looking for fossils and studying bird fossils specifically. And I also work on modern collections, so looking at extant bird skins and feathers and studying their color and how their color functions and has evolved through time. And that's what I'm going to talk about with you today. So as you've heard from a couple people already today, color has a lot of different uses in animals. And so it can function in a lot of different contexts. So we see that living animals use color for camouflage, either while hunting or evading predators, as you see here in this gecko. This is actually a gecko right here, perfectly camouflaged to look like the leaf. We see it acting in very warning contexts, such as you see down here in this caterpillar and this poison dart frog that are actually warning predators that I taste bad or I'm poisonous, please don't eat me. And in other cases, color functions to attract mates or kind of communicate with members of their own species. So here we have some mating displays by hummingbirds, a cuttlefish, and then birds of paradise. So color is very important for living animals, and we know that. But how does it function in extinct animals, and how can we maybe figure out what colors extinct animals were? Well, turning back to dinosaurs, when we think of dinosaurs, a lot of times what we might picture is something like this: going to a museum, seeing these large imposing skeletons, and getting a good idea of size and overall shape, maybe how toothy or spiky they were. And that gives us a really great idea of how they were functioning very generally. How big were they? What kind of role did they play in their environment? Were they a predator? Were they prey? Did they eat fruit? Did they eat seeds? And so this is a very good starting point. And as we've seen in a lot of talks today, sometimes we get super lucky and we get exceptional preservation of these fossils. And in these cases, we get outlines of skin, maybe even feathers, as you can see here, these beautifully preserved wings. And that gives us a better idea of tissue covering. So what was this animal that was fuzzy or scaly, spiky? Did it have weird filaments? And then if we can study the preserved molecules in those skin and feather impressions, we can start to get reconstructions of color itself. And so you've probably seen these guys, they've been very famous in the news. We can get these really accurate reconstructions of color in extinct animals by studying living animals and the colors that they express and comparing it to what we see in these fossils. And so what we know about color is that it often comes from pigments. So here I'm specifically showing birds, this is what I focus on, but there is a really wide range of pigments that we can see in living animals. Most often color is pigment based, but in some cases it's also based on the structure of the skin or feathers themselves. So in this case, iridescent and blue color is usually structurally based. And what we know from fossils is that most of the time we get just melanin and structural color preserved. So you saw in an earlier talk what those melanosome structures can look like. And that's going to allow us to get really good reconstructions of color that is brown, black, or gray, or again, those structural colors. But today, what I'm going to talk about are carotenoids. So carotenoids are another very common pigment seen in vertebrates. They're very common and mostly talked about in birds because they are so colorful. And this is a kind of color that we don't typically find in fossils, which I'm going to get into. So those are in living birds, what carotenoids can look like. And here's some more examples. Carotenoids are most commonly producing red, orange, and yellow colors in living animals. So all of these birds here are expressing carotenoids. You've got bright reds and a couple different tissues, really beautiful yellows and oranges. And these pigments can combine with other types of coloration to make greens and purples as well. And what we know about carotenoids in living animals is that they are used across reptiles. So here what you can see in this really simplified phylogenetic tree Every group that is highlighted in orange is a group that we know uses carotenoids for coloration. And so what that looks like in lizards can be oranges and yellows. In turtles, that can be bright reds and yellows. And in living birds, it's this wide rainbow array of colorations. But notably, what you'll notice, oops, here are the birds. But what you'll notice is that crocodiles actually do not have these kinds of pigments. They're not brightly colored like the rest of the reptiles that we might observe. And you'll also notice that there's really this interesting gap, this question of what was going on in extinct dinosaurs and pterosaurs. So we don't know what these extinct animals were doing. We know that a lot of living groups do express carotenoids, and we know kind of how it works. Well, part of why we don't know what extinct dinosaurs and pterosaurs were doing as far as carotenoid coloration is because carotenoids degrade really quickly. So this is a kind of pigment that is relatively fragile. And so this is an example of a color you might see in a carotenoid colored feather, the bright orange. And this is the structure of the pigment that actually confers that color. And what we see is that with time and exposure to things like light and even oxygen and heat, and then chemical abrasion, is that these compounds break apart, they degrade, and we lose that color that the carotenoid originally gave the tissue. And so because of this and the speed at which carotenoids break apart, carotenoids themselves have never been detected specifically in a vertebrate fossil. Some traces might have been found in bacteria fossils, and we might have found some organelles that produce carotenoids, but the carotenoids themselves are not found in vertebrate tissues. And so there's no direct evidence of their use in extinct vertebrates. Something that I think is really interesting about carotenoids is also where they came from. So carotenoids are really interesting in that they cannot be made by reptiles themselves. They actually have to come from environmental sources, and that is in the form of diet. So animals eat stuff and then they metabolize it and turn it into the color that we see. So the most often what we think about for carotenoid diet are things like crustaceans and fruits and seeds. Those dietary items are very rich in carotenoids. Animals eat them, metabolize them, and then make the beautiful colors. And so these colors are then seen in a lot of different tissue types. And those tissue types include skins and keratinous tissues, as well as feathers themselves. And something that we wanted to think about when thinking about color expression is how these tissues are growing. Different tissues grow at very different speeds, which means that color is deposited at different rates. And so we get in birds specifically tissues that grow really fast, and that's skin tissues to replace relatively quickly. We get tissues that are more slow growing, and those are keratins like scales and beak keratin. And then finally, we have our feathers, which are very slow growing. They're only grown maybe twice a year. And that's the only time when carotenoids can be deposited in them. And so with all of this in mind, there were a couple of questions that I had about carotenoid color. So first of all, in birds, where do we most often see this kind of color? Is it mostly in the feathers, or is it in things like the skin tissue? Secondly, how is diet related to expression of carotenoids in different tissues? You would think if you're eating a lot of carotenoids, you would then have more carotenoids expressed. But is that always true? We wanted to investigate that. And then finally, could we expect extinct dinosaurs and pterosaurs to have expressed carotenoids? Since we don't have the fossil evidence themselves, that's why we turn to our living groups. And so to investigate this, we collected data across Archaeosauria. So that's the group of animals that includes turtles, crocodiles, and all living birds. And so we did this by looking at over 4,000 species of living birds. And we also looked at 12 non-birds, so turtles and crocodiles. And then for each individual species, we looked at color across the body and said if color was either present or absent in 7 different body regions. And so those regions were the eye tissue, their face tissue, any skin that was exposed on the neck, any skin on the legs, and the leg scales, their beak keratin, and of course the plumage. And so with these 7 body regions, we were also able to take into account the different growing speeds of tissues themselves. So the fastly replaced skin tissue all the way to the really slow growing feathers. So for each bird species, we're very lucky in birdland to have a lot of resources on bird color. Birders love to go out and quantify color. And so there are a lot of peer-reviewed studies on color in general. So we collected it based on peer-reviewed published literature of where these colors are expressed. And a lot of that was looking at scientific illustrations of birds and then turning to the internet. So widely available, publicly available photographs of each species. And we were able to look at how color changes across time in these birds and say for each of the body regions if it was carotenoid or not. And then we also collected for a smaller set of birds dietary data, really detailed information on what these birds are eating. And then once we get that information on what is actually being eaten, we were able to classify their diet on kind of a sliding scale of how rich in carotenoids that was. So that ranged all the way from the lowest or the lowest level of carotenoid intake being mostly based on seeds and small vertebrate prey, then going up to invertebrate, fruit eaters, and then even diatom and algae specialists. So this is what the data actually looked like. So this is all of our birds depicted on a phylogenetic tree, and you can see our turtles and our crocodiles here on the far right. And this rainbow is it showing where we quantified color for each individual species. And so each color represents a different region that we looked at. And then the red is just a summarizing category. So is there color anywhere on this bird or turtle or crocodile? And so what you can see right away is that carotenoids are most commonly found not in feathers. So feathers here are shown in purple. There's really not that much expression of carotenoids in feathers across all these birds. But what we do see is a lot more expression specifically on things like the legs in both the scales and in the skin. And then we analyzed all this data using phylogenetic comparative methods. So we took into consideration the evolutionary histories and relationships of these animals and were able to estimate ancestral states based on the data that we collected. And so when we did that, we found that ancestrally, skin and non-feathered keratin was about 50% likely in dinosaurs, extinct pterosaurs, and even the ancestral bird. So if it was present in these extinct animals, it was probably not in feathers, but could have been in skin or other keratins. When we looked at the diet information, we found that the higher the amount of carotenoids in the diet, this was associated with more tissue types and more body regions expressing these kinds of colors. And so essentially what that means is that mostly vegetarian groups had a lot more expression of carotenoids, which is to be expected. Interestingly, though, this was seen to be true across all the tissue types. So it wasn't associated with one specific tissue, just a generally more colorful expression. So to kind of put that all into context of what our extinct animals might have been doing, this tree is showing very simplified where all of the birds are we collected data for, our turtles and crocodiles, and our extinct groups. And we also mapped on the kinds of tissues that we know these groups had. So ancestrally, all these groups had skin and scales present, and then further up in dinosaurs and theropods, we start to get weird filament structures and then onto feathers. And so what we could expect is that ancestrally, all these guys, it was likely that carotenoids were present, whether or not they were expressed, it's about a 50-50 chance. And then that chance gets higher as you get closer to birds as we know them today. On a dietary side of things, we would expect this to potentially increase in the Cretaceous. And we would expect that because that's when angiosperms or flowering plants, the plants that produce fruit, really expanded their ranges and exploded. They diversified all across the world. So we get a lot more variety in carotenoid sources in the Cretaceous, which might have correlated with more colorful expression in these extinct groups. So could dinosaurs express carotenoids? It's definitely possible. It's most likely to be found in those skin tissues and non-feathered keratins. So again, the scales and beak. And we also really have to think about diet. Is this a carnivorous animal or more of a fruit-eating, seed-eating animal? And if the diet is more rich in carotenoids, then there's a higher likelihood of finding carotenoids in non-feathered tissues. So if we look at our extinct animals, this is what we could potentially see. We could see really bright colors in all of these different regions. And that includes some keratinous, scaly regions, skin along the face, and all these different animals. But until we can really increase fossil detection of these kinds of pigments, this is what we know for now. Hopefully we get those fossils in the future or those techniques in the future. And yeah, so thank you so much for your time. I'm happy to take any questions.